Well, hello and welcome to what will likely be the last of our Armchair Chronicles, at least for a little while. Normally we have Wednesday night go on a little bit of a hiatus over the summer, and we're going to be doing a similar thing, except instead of having nothing at all, we're going to be doing our summer study through C.S. Lewis's book, Mere Christianity. So stay tuned for how we're going to be going through that. The question that we're going to be looking at today is one of those ultimate questions, one of those questions for which there seems to be no answer, and indeed there may not be a perfectly satisfactory answer. I don't know that there is on this side of eternity, but the question is what we often call the mystery of iniquity, or how can a fully sovereign God, a God that is omnipotent, all-powerful, and all good, allow the presence of evil? And this is one of the most difficult questions to answer for the Christian, for anyone for that matter, and that is this question of the existence and the presence of evil. Philosophers have been struggling with this question for millennia and have come up with any number of suggestions. Early Greek and Roman philosophers and religious devotees attempted to provide an answer by taking away the thought of a truly sovereign or sinless deity. And they created these mythologies of many gods and demigods who, in their own shortcomings, governed the shortcomings of man. Others have suggested that there is no divinity at all. There is no such thing as a god, a demigod, fully sovereign or otherwise, but there's simply atheistic evolution. And this seems helpful at first, this thought that, well, there's no moral right or wrong, therefore evil is not a problem. But it completely undermines the thought of having a moral right and a wrong, leaving nothing but Darwin's survival of the fittest, which in truth is a very weak position for anyone who, on a philosophical level, delves into its depths, especially if you look at its practical and moral application to human sickness and suffering. Still others have suggested that there may be a God of some sovereignty, but he certainly cannot be completely sovereign, and certainly not completely good. There must be something sadistic and wicked in his nature that prompts him to both allow and even to create wickedness. And this too ends up being an untenable position for many reasons. For the Christian, though, who assumes, and we will do this for the purpose of this lesson, who assumes the sovereignty of God, we do have this question still. It's often been called the Achilles heel of the Christian faith. It's been suggested by philosophers such as John Stuart Mill that the existence of evil is proof, scientific proof almost, that God is either not omnipotent or he is not good and loving. One of these must be true. This whole realm of philosophical thought within Christianity, within the thought of deity, is what we call theodicy. And this comes from a couple of Greek words meaning God, theo, and justification. And it attempts to justify God for the existence of evil. Along with other theologians and Christian philosophers and the like, I cannot say that I have heard a truly and fully satisfactory explanation for what we often call, like I've said, what we often call this mystery of iniquity. But there are some helpful things that we can say about it that can point us in the right direction. So as disappointing as it might be, I cannot pretend to offer a closed and shut answer that leaves no remaining questions. But there are some things that we know to be true that can be helpful and bring us to a point of trusting in the things that we do know, that God is both truly sovereign and completely good. Ligonier Ministries, Desiring God, the Gospel Coalition, and many others have done their best to provide at least somewhat adequate answers to this, and I've included a good deal of that information in this video. If you'd like the links to the articles or other resources, please let me know and I'll be happy to get those to you. One of the things that they suggest is sometimes the best way to start dealing with an issue is to go back to the earliest discussions of that issue. For this conversation and the mystery of iniquity, this holds true, I think. One of the most important approaches to the problem of evil was first suggested by Augustine, who is a 4th, 5th century theologian and Bible scholar, later by Aquinas in the 13th century. They argued, and their proposal was that evil itself does not have an independent being. That is, it is not its own entity. It cannot be defined as a thing, a substance, a being, or an entity on its own. Rather, they suggested that evil must be defined as an action that does not meet the standard of goodness. This, of course, necessitates an understanding of what is good. And so Augustine says that evil is by definition parasitic, since its definition, the definition of evil, depends on good, the definition of good. Even the words we often use to describe evil depend on the definition of good, don't they? We think of disobedience, not obedient. Immorality, not moral. Unrighteous, not righteous. Ungodly, unholy, ignoble, dishonorable. All of these words are negating or standing against the standard of good. And so before we can even begin to have a problem with evil, we must first admit to there being some sort of standard of good. The postmodern movement tried to give an answer by saying that all truth is relative. Your truth is true for you, my truth is true for me, but your truth is not true for me, nor is my truth true for you. This relative morality has really been rejected in large part because it lacks any true ability to stand up to the rigors of even the more shallow philosophical examinations. You end up with a society with a morality that is completely truncated, that has no legs to stand on. And so what remains is that there must be a standard of good that is, existentially superior to, above, or in some kind of authority over society and human activity. This truth requires then, if there is such a standard, that there must be or there must have been a giver of, or someone who has set that standard of good. A standard of good cannot create or set itself. This would then become its own entity in a sense. From a Christian worldview, this is answered very directly. We have a sovereign God who is the author of what is moral and right, and He created the standard, and indeed He is that standard, which is complete perfection, nothing less. And so while this does not necessarily give us the answer to our search for the origin of evil, the Christian must hold to two things. First of all, that God is truly sovereign and that God is truly good. R.C. Sproul with Ligonier Ministries follows the line of reasoning then that in His omnipotence and goodness, and follow me here, in God's omnipotence and goodness, there must be a place for the existence of evil. We know that God Himself never does that which is evil. Look at James. Nevertheless, He also ordains whatsoever comes to pass. Anything that comes to pass, God has either allowed or done. Though He does not do evil and He does not create evil, He does ordain that evil exists. If it does exist, and if God is sovereign, then obviously He must have been able to prevent its existence. If He allowed evil to enter into this universe, it could only be by His sovereign decision. Since His sovereign decisions always follow the perfection of His being, this perfect being, this giver of the moral law, we must conclude that His decision to allow evil to exist is a good decision. Here too we must be very careful. It would be easy to tiptoe across the line and say that evil is good or good is evil with this line of thought. This does not obviously line up with what Scripture teaches us. But we can say that in the omniscience, the all-knowingness, and the goodness of God, It is good that evil exists because it exists ultimately to fulfill the designs and the purposes of God. We must also remind ourselves that it is God's design and purpose that will lead to the ultimate defeat and destruction of all evil. It is God's goodness that will remain forever, while evil will one day be completely eradicated. Revelation 21 speaks to this very strongly. Ravi Zacharias, a marvelous Christian philosopher who has recently passed away, he also speaks to this question of how a good God can allow evil. And he mentions a couple of things, Ravi does. First, he says, and this goes along with the thought that a moral right by definition requires the ability to choose a moral wrong. Ravi says that love is the supreme ethic. He gets this, I think, largely from 1 John 4, verses 7 through 21. In verses 7 through 12, we read, "Beloved, let us love one another. For love is from God, and whoever loves has been born of God and knows God. Anyone who does not love does not know God," is how it goes. Does not know God because God is love. Verse 9, as it goes along, "In this the love of God was made manifest among us, that God sent His only Son into the world, so that we might live through Him. And this is love, not that we have loved God, but that He loved us and sent His Son to be the propitiation for our sins. Beloved, if God so loved us, we also ought to love one another. No one has ever seen God. If we love one another, God abides in us, and His love is perfected in us." And then go on and read the rest of that to verse 21. Ravi goes on to say that with this great gift of being able to choose to love God comes the great calamity of being able to choose to not love God. This, of course, brings with it all of the consequences of pain, of suffering, death, and more that those who have chosen not to love God and follow His word bring upon themselves and upon others. The answer that Christianity offers us, that no other religion or philosophy or other thought can offer, is that God can provide the ultimate answer to this difficult question in eternity by giving eternal joy and life to those who have been enabled to love God, and eternal justice then, giving eternal justice and punishment to those who have chosen to hate God. So where does this leave the Christian? What does the presence of evil mean for us? It has a few implications for us that help answer some of the why of evil, but not necessarily some of the how of evil. First of all, evil in the world creates in us a longing for when we will one day go to be with the Lord, in whose presence there is no evil and no evil can stand. Secondly, the presence of evil spurs us on, or at least it ought to pursue the calling of the Christian, to meet the needs of others, to practice justice for the oppressed, to care for the needy, to feed the hungry, clothe the naked, as we read in Matthew 25. Can we take on the whole world and bring an end to every evil person and every corrupt system? No, we can't. But we can be faithful to be the salt and the light that we've been called to be, the salt and light of the gospel wherever we are. Thirdly, then, the presence of evil in the world can be a mirror for us as we see how we easily can also fall into the wickedness that once we formerly condemned. Galatians 6 speaks about this. Fourthly, it forces us to rely on God, to look to Him for help when the evil things of the world seem to be pressing in on us from every side. It forces us to look to the Lord. Fifthly, then, it works in us humility as we realize our own wickedness and dependence on God to cure us from that wickedness that otherwise we would fall into. And He does this through the gospel of Jesus Christ. No, the presence of evil is not an illusion. It is sadly very, very real. Scripture is clear on this. You can open up to just about any passage And this struggle of man's rebellion against God's righteousness is everywhere. The book of Romans is a great place to go for a theological examination of this thought. The book of Judges is a great place to go for illustrations, a very practical picture of the wickedness of man. We must also recognize in this that evil is not arbitrary. It's not something that just is and does whatever it wants. We must recognize that God's rule over evil also is not arbitrary or capricious. God does not throw a dart at the world with a blindfold and then peek to see what damage has been done. Within this, we also know that there is not always a direct connection between sin and God's punishment. The book of Job is a great example of this. A righteous man on whom fell great evil because he was righteous, and God was glorifying himself through him. This was, in a sense, the reason for the difficulty that came to Job. Similar to this, the man born blind in John chapter 9. He was born blind so that the works of God might be displayed in him. Another thing, as we head toward the close of this, another thing that we must recognize is that the world in which we live is a fallen world. Romans 8 speaks to this very strongly. It tells us that all of creation is groaning and longing for when all things will be made right again. And that day is coming when the evil of this world will be done away with, and God will set in place a new heavens and a new earth. Which brings me to the final thought that I want to encourage us with as we wrestle with this mystery of iniquity. How is there evil in the world? One final thing we should take away is that evil is not the ultimate end. While we would never deny the horrible nature of evil, we would never say that evil will win the day or have power over or even equal to God. This is not a Taoist struggle between the yin and the yang, two equal but opposing forces. God has complete and ultimate power over evil. And it will be crushed one day, completely destroyed, stamped out, and eradicated. This is the hope of the Christian, and the only thing that can keep us really putting one foot in front of the other as we observe the depravity and the wickedness around us. All of this will pass away, and what will remain is the goodness of God. As it says in Revelation 21, verses 1 through 5, "Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth. For the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and there was no longer any sea. I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride, beautifully dressed for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, 'Look, God's dwelling place is now among the people, and he will dwell with them. They will be his people, and God himself will be with them and be their God, and he will wipe away every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death, or mourning, or crying, or pain, for the old order of things has passed away.'" Then it says there in verse 5, "He who was seated on the throne said, 'I am making everything new.' And he said to John, 'Write this down, for these words are trustworthy and true.'" By way of summary, there is a moral code of what is right and wrong. Therefore, there must be a giver of that moral code of right and wrong. Secondly, without evil, there would be no concept of what is good. Everything would be neutral. It would just be. Thirdly, if God never allowed man to do anything wrong, then the doctrine of the free will of man would be undermined entirely. Fourthly, God is sovereign over both the good and the evil. There is nothing that is either done by the hand of God or allowed by the hand of God that is one way or the other outside of God's sovereign hand. It is either done or allowed by God's ordaining hand. Fifthly, then, it is to the Christian, falls to the Christian to follow that which God has given us as right. And Micah 6:8 answers that very directly. "He has shown you, O man, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? To do justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God.